So, today, segment 12 and 13, we just finished segment 12. And in segment 12, I was approaching educational innovation from the end, from where I personally started, my own narrative, if you want to, starting at some point in time teaching this course, and from there realizing more and more that I was sailing into territories that are much larger in terms of educational reform. That there was a potential working with narrative and with qualitative that moved me, nilly-willy, automatically into innovative territory. So in segment 13, I want to follow the way I had set up this whole series of 13 segments, namely starting out with the shortcomings of education. Remember, that's where we worked with Ken Robinson, with Nancy Budwig's work, and with Keith Sawyer's. And I worked a little bit through them as people who have done some really critical work, thinking about current education and showing what is problematic. And from there, I worked a little bit deeper into the learning culture of students, of institutions, of teachers. From there, moving into considering alternatives, and then coming up with these 8 ways of procedurally doing work in the classroom and through the classroom differently, in particular more reflective, using portfolios, small groups, etc. And from there, then I moved to qualitative and narrative. And from afar, this looks like at least 2 different topics. One is the renovation, the change of education, and the other one is teaching qualitative and narrative. And from afar, they don't have anything to do. So what I was trying in segment 12 is showing how I personally unwrapped this and saw that qualitative narrative lends itself to bring students a perspective within which they become more engaged, within which they have the potential to explore, make mistakes, and look at the confusing world that is not predictable, so to speak. And now I want to go one last time over the kinds of segments that we have been talking about over the last couple of weeks, and again lead up to qualitative and narrative. So we started out with this critique of the current learning cultures. And one argument was, and I think this may still be with you, that the current ideology of learning is based on the 19th century model of mind production, I called it. Mind production not as brainwashing, but assuming that the mind can be trained over time, and that this has to take place in buildings, in schools, as a relatively new idea. In Europe, at least, bringing people together, and in particular all people equally, not just the people of ruling or upper classes, and assuming that everybody can learn in the same way. In that sense also assuming that we are all equal, right? I mean, this is one of the principles, not just of the French Revolution, but of democracy in general. And there's definitely nothing wrong, quite the opposite. I mean, we are all equal. But then, in one of my segments, I showed you the identity dilemmas. We are all also different. And that is something that I think, but also Keith Sawyer and Sir Ken Robinson and Nancy Budwig argue that we have to embrace. We have to embrace our differences. Yeah, there's nothing wrong that we are different, and in order to learn how we differ from others and can complement one another, we have to explore what we are good at and what we are less good at. So this is where the issue of we are all equal, to a degree, may be backfiring. Yeah, because it assumes, like on a conveyor belt, every student sails through the school, and the different teachers put their little screws into the students, so that ultimately the knowledgeable mind comes out of it, and not realizing that some of the screws may not fit, to remain within this metaphor in this picture. That some things just don't work because we are different. And difference is a very, very positive thing, because difference is possibly the mother of change. Because if we weren't different, what would drive change? What would drive to change the world and try to make it a better place? So these are the issues that we briefly discussed and talked about, in addition to, and I think this was in particular Robinson's argument, that teaching is, or learning is not personalized. It is impersonal. Every student is the same. I treat you all alike. And in that sense, it's also disengaging, at least potentially disengaging, and falling short of the 21st century challenges, where we need engaged scholars, where we need people who make whatever it is that they do their own. And this leads us exactly to the identity issues that we uncovered, that we make projects or important questions, issues our own, in our work as well as in our private lives. But that's where there seem to be all three who have problems: institutions, instructor, teachers, but also learners and students, because we consider learning, being in school, as work. And work is different from being at home, watching television, smoking a cigarette. I'm just kidding. But having a nice time at home, where we are, so to speak, ourselves. But at work, we do something that is much more part of an alienated, thingified situation. So these kinds of identity issues for institutions, for instructors, teachers, as well as for students, learners, need to be considered and actually reconsidered. We cannot continue to have this split of our identity of when we are at work, we do our work from 5 to 9 or from 9 to 5. 5 to 9 would be night shift. But rather, we have to bring our personal identity and our, let's call that professional identity, into a unit, and not separate them and have one at home and the other one at work, and are two different people. So these are the kinds of aspects that we considered for a short while a couple of weeks ago in segment 2 and 3, and try to look at what is possible, what kind of alternatives can we create, reconsidering the institutions, so that institutions are giving the space where innovative, creative work can take place, and it's not just work that is trying to ready students for tests, where engagement can take place, in particular with projects that learners say, this is something I'm really interested in, I'm invested in, I want to accomplish something here. It's small but doable, and I have a group of almost good friends or co-workers, collaborators, within which we can accomplish something. Yeah. So those are the kinds of orientations or alternatives that we had briefly talked about. And the focalization here, and that was my attempt, my contribution, if I can say so, defocalizing the content, the what of what is being learned. Not doing away with this. Don't misunderstand me, don't get me wrong. But stronger focusing on the processes of learning, of what we actually do in learning, in situations, also in school, but also outside of school. Yeah. And again, let me underscore this very strongly. Content is always there, is always important. But in previous decades, we kind of, in our school reforms and the higher education reform, focused very strongly how we can wrap the content in a nicer package so that our learners are more likely to eat. Yeah, but that did not turn out to work that well. It's not the packaging. My assumption or my suggestion is it's really almost radically different. Yeah, we cannot talk about the content at the same time as we talk about these processes, these procedures. We should separate them to a degree in order to have a clearer idea what we do in which kind of branch here. Of course, they always come together, yeah. But in order to think more clearly about renovating learning, to really change this from the learning culture that we are stuck in, we may have to think a little bit more radically about the procedures, the processes. So that was what we were talking about. And again, I just led you through this. Yeah, I think the portfolio method is a really very, very, very important tool, because otherwise I have no better answer to how we can get our students to reflect on where was I at the beginning of the semester, where am I now? And you need the material to look at it, because if you just brainstorm and use your intuition, and this is where not just students, learners, but we ourselves as well, teachers and institutions, we overestimate ourselves. Yeah, we assume, yeah, I knew that. I knew that when I was 5 years old already. Yeah, so this is our typical overestimation of what we learned and when we learned whatever it is. Because learning is a very subtle process. Yeah, it's not that we can pinpoint it and say, yeah, this is what I learned at 11 o'clock on December 15th in 2006. No, it doesn't work that way. It's a very slow, gradual, subconscious process. But we can pinpoint it by looking at the portfolio, by looking at my previous writing. And I told you before that sometimes when I look at my previous writings, I'm embarrassed. But sometimes I say, gee, that was really much better than I write now. Yeah. So this happens. But it is a good process, and we are not really, so far at least, helped to look back at our own works, yeah, in a course, over a number of courses within a curriculum, and also then with a portfolio. I mentioned that when we talked about that in a lot more detail. This is something you can show and tell, yeah, employers, others, your teacher. Yeah, it is a method also to assess for others your progress. And it is a much better method, trust me, than quizzes and tests. And I see some of you nodding. The portfolio checks again, yeah, as something where you as a mentor are in close contact with where your students are, how they progress, and where they need help. Yeah, so you can move in or can work with the team. And then the third one, the red one, the learning objectives, to spell them out is so important. Yeah, in segment 12, I told you how I learned that, possibly even the hard way. But here, I'm just giving them as agenda, yeah, on the way to do some real renovation in classrooms and outside of classrooms. So what we can do now here is summing up and wrapping up, where the qualitative narrative is a space, yeah, is a problem space, just like quantitative experimental is also a space, a problem space. And these are spaces that lend themselves for learners' identity development. Identity development, again, so that they can navigate their agency. Yeah, at certain times, they put themselves more into the agentive role and do things, and at other times, they are more the consumer, where the world is coming to them. In collaborative teams as well, you change roles, you navigate, yeah, where you navigate in collaboration with others the differences and the sameness with others, yeah, and where you also can navigate your change, you know, of what is it that you are adding on, or where do you have some radical changing, transforming experiences, learning experiences, yeah, where you kind of almost change the paradigm from wanting to do experiments for your master's thesis in phonetics to doing a qualitative study of gender differences in the classroom. Maybe. All right. Yeah. Or you do it the other way around. You started out with something that has some social impact, presumably, and you said, no, you know, some phonetic experiments are a lot more important because, and you have hopefully a good rationale. Okay, but that's what qualitative and narrative, the way I pursue it and the way I hope I presented it, in particular with the exercises, in-class exercises, and also the kinds of projects that the learners are doing outside the class. Yeah, these are the problem-solving spaces that open themselves up for the learner, where they find some real-world challenges, yeah, where the focus is on other people, not on the self, at least not originally. You don't start with yourself and introspect and from there try to understand others, but rather you start with the understanding of others, their intentions, their motivations, their emotions, from where they come, and you bring that into your understanding of yourself as a researcher, as a person, and in that sense also classroom is much closer to the real world with qualitative and narrative than, in my opinion, it is if you do experiments. Again, it can be. You can do experiments that are very closely related to the real world. But in order to do the experiments well, you have to cut out the contextual factors, right? And you do have to do this in order to be and remain without your biases and emotions, remain objective, so to speak, and follow the procedures that the community, the professional community has designed. In qualitative, it's up to the student. The student has to decide and justify the procedures. And that there is no profession in that sense, or police that says this is good and this is bad, but rather it is the process within which you lay down and lay open how you proceeded in finding X, Y, or Z, in which you can convince others that your work is qualitative, that it is good. And in that sense, the window is open here to exactly managing a more complex world with the kinds of contexts that are continuously changing, that are not scripted, where there is a good amount of uncertainty, and where there is a world that is constantly changing. These are the kinds of conditions that we started out with at the very beginning. That's what is characteristic of the 21st century, so to speak, or at least we realized it. And now we are back that in these kinds of work in qualitative frameworks are exactly dealing with complexity, uncertainty, and in that sense help us to hopefully break frames, think more in a divergent fashion, collaborate with others in, with, and across differences, and work toward a better future. Sounds nice. Thank you.